All right. Everybody comfortable? All right, here we go. This is a talk that I gave at church about a month ago, and unfortunately, the screen recording didn't work as I was giving the talk there in front of a live audience. So I am recording this again in Manahawkin, New Jersey, at my in-laws' house with an audience of 2 people. I hope they enjoy it. I hope everyone enjoys it. This is the talk is called "Cultivating the Gift of Awe," and I'll try and explain what I mean by that in a little bit, I guess. But first, a little information about this talk that you're about to see. This presentation, the slides here, contains exactly 2,309 words. I'm going to try to impress you with some statistics here. With 705 occurrences of the letter A, 124 occurrences of the letter B, and 1,211 occurrences of the letter E. Are you impressed with that?
Yeah. Oh, very.
Yeah? Yeah, I don't know if this is impressive to you. What should impress you? If you think about this a little bit, you will become more impressed, I hope. Because it's a little touchy to actually produce these words. This is entirely accurate. After I prepared the slides, I went through the whole thing with a computer program and counted exactly how many letters of each. And this slide right here was the last one I did, because if you think about it, as I was writing even this slide right here, like these words here about this talk, if I had chosen slightly different words there, that would have changed slightly the number of, say, the letter A here. And then I'd have to redo this number, but this number, see, what's impressive here is that I actually spelled out the number, right? If I had used the digits there, the numerical, the numerals, it wouldn't be so impressive, but I spelled out the number so that if I had actually made a small change and changed the number of A's, I would have to write different words here, and that again would change the number of A's. And if you think about it, everything here has to be exactly just so in order for these counts to be accurate. And it's a little tricky. And there's some cases in which it's actually impossible to write a description in this way, just because it doesn't work out. Like 1,211 E's. If I decide to use one fewer E, I'd have to change the 11 to a 10, but that actually removes 2 E's, which messes the whole thing up. So this is actually a real tricky thing. I hope that you're a little bit impressed, at least at this point. I actually had to cheat a little bit on this, which you'll see. See that right there?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. That was to adjust the total number of E's in order for these numbers to work out. But this sort of a thing is something that people, computer scientists and mathematicians, like to talk about. This sort of a thing. This would be referred to sort of as a self-referential kind of slide here, because I am trying to describe in a very specific way the structure of the entire talk. And you can imagine this would be even more difficult if I had actually tried to describe the frequencies of all the letters, just A, B, and E. I was getting off easy with this. Trying to do this in general is almost impossible, really, to make it all fit. It's because we're trying to describe the thing. I'm trying to write a description which is describing in part itself. It's a little complicated. All right, anyway, that's enough of that. What this talk is about, I'll try and give a little introduction. I think God calls us to do big things, and this is kind of about bigness in a sense. God also sees us as valuable, but the world is very, very big. By the world, I mean like everything that exists. The universe is very, very big, and we people, human beings, are very, very small. What do we think about this? Science, in the past few hundred years, science has revealed the true nature of our universe. This is what you'll hear people say, at least. One thing is clear: We are very small, the universe is very big, and there is no clear purpose to anything. This is what people say is one of the, major discoveries of science of the 20th century, one of the major themes of science of the 20th century. Science doesn't actually say there is no clear purpose to anything. That's a common interpretation of science. But this is in the air, at least in our culture, I think. Here's a quote from Kurt Vonnegut at the beginning of one of his books. He says, "All persons living or dead are purely coincidental." This is something that's happened in the past couple hundred years. As we learn more and more about the world, there's been a steady progression from we are special to we are not special. This seems to be the arc of mankind's view of itself as informed by science in the last couple hundred years. This is a quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's kind of a modern day Carl Sagan. He says, "Human beings, we are a speck on a speck on a speck on a speck," referring to our tiny stature in the vast universe. And obviously Christians would disagree with, at least with the interpretation of the facts, although I don't think it's really possible for Christians to disagree that the universe is big and that we are small. And in fact, that is part of Christian doctrine. But Christians at some level have to disagree that humankind is not special, or that we are meaningless. But like I said, unfortunately, the whole concept is based on real facts that we can't really deny. So I want to talk about significance and insignificance. How can we as Christians respond to the realities of our smallness and the bigness of the universe, but respond in a way which is, consistent with our faith and is sort of intellectually responsible to the truth that we can see out there. How can we live faithfully in a vast world that doesn't seem to notice us? This is something that I think we all wonder about at some level, or at least I think that we should. All right, so let's start with a basic assumption here. I hope that we can all agree. Our Christian faith must be based on truth. I think the truth cannot defeat our faith. Jesus said the truth will set us free. So as Christians, I don't think that we should ever be in the business of hiding from the truth or being afraid of investigating, being afraid of finding the truth, because our faith is based on truth. It needs to be. That's what I said. Christians should never fear or turn away from the truth. And new truths which are discovered by science must be incorporated into our faith, because our faith must be based on truth. And if we learn new truths, then they should become part of our faith. And sometimes this means new truths must correct our faith. I don't know, this might sound a little controversial. I'm not really trying to say anything controversial here. I'm referring to things like, the Christian church in general used to believe that the earth was flat and that the earth was the center of the universe. The sun went around the earth, and now we know that that's not true anymore. And so we don't believe that anymore. And that, some aspects of what we believe need to be changed and corrected when we discover new truths about the universe. Anyway, here's some common ingredients to a biblical view of humanity. This is kind of a contrast to what I was talking about before, about the sort of mainstream interpretation of science. A biblical view of humanity typically includes believing that human beings are the pinnacle of God's creation. I think that's more or less explicitly stated in the Bible. Human beings have a unique moral status amongst God's creation. Human beings are capable of being good or evil in ways that, say, animals are not. And God created the universe in order to create the earth and humanity. This one maybe is not so obvious, although I think that that's implied. So you might not necessarily believe that these are all literally true, but they are implied, at least by a typical Christian worldview. I don't think the Bible says that the whole purpose of the entire universe is so that the earth and humanity might exist. Although that is kind of what the Bible is about. The Bible doesn't really say very much about anything beyond the earth and beyond humanity and its relationship to God. So at least reading the Bible gives you the impression that the only purpose to anything existing is that the earth exists and that human beings exist. Anyway, these 3 points here and other common ingredients of biblical view, they don't contradict reality as we now know it. They don't contradict anything that science has discovered. But I think there is a dissonance, mainly between the idea of seeing ourselves as important and meaningful, and perhaps as the only meaningful thing that exists anywhere, versus seeing ourselves as tiny specks in a huge empty universe. So how do we as Christians respond to this dissonance? Like I say, Christians have to more or less agree with both things, at least as far as the facts go. So I think it's commonly accepted. This is a common viewpoint that science and faith are in conflict, and specifically the science of cosmology, that is the origins and the structure of the universe as a whole, and specifically human origins, the science of human origins. It's commonly believed that these are in conflict with faith, but I don't believe that they are. There are billions of Christians all over the world who do not deny any of the the truths or the results of mainstream science. I think we have issues in the United States about evolution, but the global church as a whole is largely unconcerned with the issue. I think it is to say that faith and science are in conflict. This is not a mainstream position among Christians across the world, and I don't believe it's a mainstream position among non-Christians either. I think it can be a test of our faith, though. As individuals, our faith can be tested by learning things about the universe, just like any test in life. And I don't think it's unchristian. It is not unchristian to recognize and feel this dissonance. I mean, it's a test in the sense that, I love my kids, and when my kids are going crazy and screaming at me, that is a test of my love for my kids. It doesn't mean that I don't love my kids. It's a test that I have to deal with, and I think you see how much I love my kids in the way that I deal with it, not just in the fact that the test exists. All right, it doesn't show a lack of faith to recognize that there is a dissonance there. I think it shows really that we're devoted to the truth. If you can just dismiss this whole thing and say, I don't need to care at all about that, I would say maybe you're not as concerned as you should be about knowing the real truth about the world that we live in. I think to recognize that there is a dissonance shows that we're devoted to knowing the truth. I think, like I said, our faith or our lack of faith is shown in how we respond to these challenges, not whether the challenge exists or not. Just like having faith in anything in our lives. I think it's helpful to me, at least, to be reminded that this kind of issue, grappling with our own insignificance, is not something that we invented. This is not unique to 20th century people. In fact, there's a whole book in the Bible whose main topic is insignificance and the futility of man's existence. That is Ecclesiastes, one of my favorite books. So, in case you're unfamiliar, this is narrated by King Solomon, and it's kind of his thoughts on mankind's existence and what it all means, sort of. There's no real story to Ecclesiastes. It's more of a, I don't know, you might say an essay or a long poem just generally about the whole purpose of human existence. And his answer is, as far as what it all means, his answer from the book seems to be not too much. This can be a kind of a depressing book. Here's some quotes. This is the very first verse of the book of Ecclesiastes. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Here's another one. Much wisdom brings much grief as well, and adding knowledge adds pain. This is not something that university professors like to say. Here's another one. God is eternal, and you are of the earth. So let your words be few. It's also not something that someone giving a lecture wants to keep in mind. This is the kind of thing that you see in the book of Ecclesiastes. And I think what's really remarkable is that there is no clear refutation of the main idea that our lives are meaningless. It's not like, he talks for one chapter about everything's meaningless, and then he says something like, by ourselves we're unimportant, but God gives us significance. I mean, this is what we as Christians believe, but you don't see any of that at all in the book of Ecclesiastes. There's no easy answers that Solomon gives, and he comes really to no absolute conclusions. There's just, you're left with a sense of overwhelming tension, which is not resolved by the author. To me, I love that about the book of Ecclesiastes. I don't really think it's a valid criticism, but people these days say, I don't like Christianity, or I don't like religion in general because it's just all about giving you easy answers. Now, I don't actually think that the Christian faith provides that kind of easy answers to everything. And Ecclesiastes is kind of an extreme example of this. It provides no answers at all, really. It just kind of raises the issue and leaves it at that. And to me, that's sort of the hallmark of someone who's being extremely honest and truthful and not trying to offer any simplistic answers, and I really appreciate that. Anyway, let's try to discuss it. So I'm also not going to try to offer any simplistic answers, but I'm going to try to say something at least. So the main question: how do we Christians respond to our own smallness? All right, I have a few alternatives. Here's one way to react to our own smallness: deny it. Famous example, maybe this is the most famous example, at least in the history of the Christian church. The church's persecution of Galileo and his heliocentrism. Galileo was one of the first to suggest that the Earth is not the center of the universe. That he said that the sun is actually the center. The Earth goes around the sun, and the other planets go around the sun. They don't go around the Earth. And the church persecuted Galileo for that very strongly. And this was a big mistake based on convictions that we today consider to be absurd. The fact that, you tell a kid about this, the fact that the church once believed very strongly that the earth did not go around the sun, that the sun went around the earth. And this was regarded as such a key doctrine in the church that they were willing to persecute one of the greatest scientific minds in history. They were so wedded to this idea, and it had become so ingrained in Christian doctrine that it was not something they were willing to budge on. This was a big mistake, and it seems kind of ridiculous to us today. A later pope admitted that this was a big mistake. You know who that was? John Paul, 1992. Can you believe that? There have been other popes before him had kind of come around. I mean, today everybody knows that Galileo was right, so it's not really something that needs to be discussed anymore, even. But I believe John Paul specifically made some statements about how Galileo was going to be completely rehabilitated. They had plans to build a statue of Galileo inside the Vatican, which I think that specific thing was canceled, but Galileo is completely rehabilitated now. Anyway, this is all about denial, right? I think denial is appropriate when you're confronted with illusions or falsehoods. That's what you should do. You should deny falsehoods, but we should never deny the truth. I think the church, specifically, this is an example, the Galileo story. The church needs to think very carefully before denying results of established science. Science has been one of the greatest forces for change and progress in the past few centuries. It's made us smarter and healthier and made our world much, much better. And if you want to look out in the world and choose your enemies, I would suggest that science is not a good enemy to choose. Established science is extremely accurate. And I mean established science, there's some sort of cutting-edge research is always a little iffy, but beyond a certain point, scientists, when they make predictions based on established science, That is extremely accurate in a way that no other discipline that humankind has ever engaged in has that amount of accuracy. Um, I think the church, has real important commentary to offer on the ethical and social questions about science, but denying the facts of established science is a disaster in the long term for anyone who tries it. I think denial makes us feel better. The church at the time of Galileo, they really thought that they were doing the right thing, and they thought that they were defending something which was a key aspect of Christian doctrine, which now we, for the most part, think that they were wrong in that. Denial may make us feel better, but it's not a serious, responsible strategy when we're talking about verifiable, demonstrable scientific fact. Denial is not a good idea in that sense. And I think it distracts the world and other people, even people within the church. It distracts us from our legitimate ethical commentary that we have that I mentioned before. I think here's a simple and kind of an extreme example that came up about a year ago in some elections, insisting that rape cannot lead to pregnancy. There was a big to-do about I believe he was a congressman who when he was asked to defend his position on abortion, he believed that there should be no allowance for abortion, even in the case of rape. And he said something like, well, if it's a legitimate rape, then it can't lead to pregnancy just because that's not possible in the human body. So this, of course, is false. Rape can lead to pregnancy. I think, I imagine he was saying that because he thought, his views on abortion are so deeply felt, and he believes it to be such an important issue that he felt like he needs to take a stand. And that's all fine. This is part of what I said about the church has real commentary to offer on ethical and social questions about science. But just because he kind of overreached a little bit, it turned the whole thing into a big discussion about what an idiot this guy is, and nobody cares about anything that he has to say about the ethics of abortion. So I think we can just distract from any kind of meaningful input that we can have to the larger discussions. All right, so denial is usually a bad idea. Here's my strategy number 2. Reaction to our own smallness is to ignore it. And I think actually, so I was kind of dismissive of the whole denial strategy. This one I'm not so dismissive of. I think honestly, this is probably what most people do most of the time in terms of thinking of our own insignificance. The fact is, we just don't think of our own significance all the time because it's hard to do anything. It's hard to be a productive member of society if you focus constantly on your own insignificance. Like, for instance, here's a little fact that the sun will eventually expand to engulf the earth in about 5 billion years or so. This is something that actually I can remember when I was a kid. I went to a summer camp. I was probably 10 years old maybe, and I remember this one day a kid who I was playing with suddenly was like, he stopped playing with us. He went off by himself and he was crying, and I asked my friends, like, what's wrong with that guy? Did he hurt himself or what? They said, no, somebody just told him that the sun would eventually expand and destroy the earth. And that was really depressing to this kid, and it really affected him. When I think back on that, it seems a little silly, but at the same time, you can hardly blame the guy. It is kind of, it's kind of something, I guess. I think you can fill in the blank here any way you like. Many of our daily activities make little sense in light of whatever. There are lots of things about, not just about the ultimate fate of the universe, but just things about the world that we live in. There are things going on all the time which are much larger than our own little things that we have to deal with. But we still have to deal with our little things anyway. And it's not very helpful to focus constantly on the bigger things. I think actually the ignore it strategy seems to be the main advice, if there is any advice at all, in the book of Ecclesiastes. Here's the the conclusion. This is the last verse in the book. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Solomon doesn't really tell us how to think about all of this or how to feel about it. He just says, if you want to know what to do about it, just do what you're doing. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the duty of all mankind. I think he's just saying, serve God and live your life. Do the best with what you've got. That sort of thing. I think it's okay, to focus on our immediate tasks and to put other things out of your mind, at least temporarily. In fact, Jesus gives us a great example of this. This is from Luke. It says, crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. I can imagine the pressure that Jesus felt being God's chosen messenger for the short time that he had on this earth. But Jesus was not, at least as we can see in the Gospels, he doesn't seem to have been a sort of a workaholic about it. Jesus helped people in powerful ways individually while he was alive, but he also, he didn't heal everybody who was looking for him. He often withdrew to be by himself or with small groups of people, when he could have been with huge groups of people. One thing that we see in Jesus' teaching, I think, is that love and service to other people is appropriate, even when it doesn't make complete sense in some larger context. I think, in the parable of the shepherd with one lost sheep who leaves the 99 other sheep, this is an example. Sometimes God values showing love on a personal level, and that is actually sometimes more valuable than this other kind of big picture perspective. I think these ideas don't make sense from a certain big picture perspective, but here's another one. Jesus says there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. This is something that actually I can remember the first time I read this, and I thought that doesn't really make any sense. But I think it's about personal connection, that God values personal relationship, individual connection, sometimes over the larger picture. Sometimes showing love trumps the big picture. I think really the entire gospel message is like this. The whole concept of a God who bleeds and dies to make people whole, that basic idea is kind of absurd from a certain big picture viewpoint. But God is showing his love radically to us as individuals, and I think this is really the only part that needs to make sense to us. That is the whole point. We don't need to worry about anything else. Here's a specific example of Jesus making human connections at the expense of pure sensibility. This is kind of something that I come back to a lot when I'm thinking about this kind of a thing. The ascension of Jesus. After Jesus died and he was resurrected, and then he had like a real body again. He was alive again. He is not alive now. That's because he ascended. He didn't actually die a second time. He just ascended into heaven. Jesus ascended physically into heaven rather than dying. That is the second time. And it says in Acts, he rose up into the sky and a cloud hid him from sight. I think this is something that I don't remember when it was in my life that I decided that this was really a bizarre event in the Bible. Maybe a unique event in the Bible. Why is it so bizarre? Because heaven isn't really up in the sky. I hope you do you agree with me on that? Heaven isn't really up in the sky. For example, going high on the swing set doesn't actually make you closer to heaven. This is something that I was at a playground once with my 5-year-old daughter and my mother. And my daughter, Josie, was so happy when we got to the playground. She ran over to the swings and immediately started swinging. And my mom came over and she said, "Oh, Josie, you're in heaven now, aren't you?" And Josie said, "Nope, I'm not going that high." That's because I guess at some level she thought that going high on the swing set makes you closer to heaven because heaven is up high. But that's actually not true, physically speaking. There are actually many Bible verses that suggest that heaven is physically, up in the sky. Although it doesn't, it's never stated explicitly. It certainly suggests that. But heaven is not up in the sky. I'm not trying to say anything controversial here. I think it's something that everybody would agree with. I hope so, at least. Actually, there isn't any such thing really as a coherent direction as a up. Because we live on the planet Earth. Here's a little helpful illustration here. I made this up myself. This is a picture of the Earth. See all these people? This guy is in France. He's got a beret on, and is a penguin in Antarctica. They're all pointing up, right? But it's different directions for everybody. This is what I mean by there actually isn't any such thing as up, really, in any kind of universal sense, right? You could say up just means away from the surface of the earth, but there's no single direction called up, Like up during the daytime is actually basically the opposite direction as up during the nighttime. There is no single such thing as up. Heaven is not up because there is no such thing as up, really. And I think actually, Christians today believe heaven isn't actually anywhere. What I mean by that, I don't mean heaven doesn't exist. I just mean it doesn't actually exist in a physical location. You can't say get in a rocket or a spaceship and fly yourself to heaven because it doesn't actually exist. It's not part of the physical universe, right? So I hope you agree. Heaven is not actually up. You can't just go up and after a while arrive in heaven because you went there. Because you can't go to heaven in that way. Anyway, why did Jesus ascend to heaven then? What kind of sense does that even make? I imagine Jesus went up, and then I suppose at the same time as he was physically going up, he was somehow spiritually traveling to heaven, and his body, I guess, stopped existing at a certain point. But why did he even go up at all? I mean, why didn't he just do that while standing on the ground? What's the point of him going up into the air behind the cloud? I think what's the point of all that? I think Jesus ascended in order to connect in a powerful and a memorable way with the people watching him. This certainly was memorable. We still have it in the book of Acts because the people who saw that remembered it, and they thought it was important. Obviously, if you saw that, you would think it was important. The physical act of Jesus going into the sky behind a cloud, I think we now would agree, that physical act doesn't make sense as a way to get to heaven. That's not how you get to heaven. Jesus obviously was not going to heaven in the conventional way, but even so, you don't get any closer to heaven by going behind a cloud. It doesn't really make sense as a physical act, but I believe Jesus did this because it was meaningful to the people who are watching him, and he needed to connect with them in kind of a dramatic and inspiring way as he was leaving this earth for good. By the way, this is kind of a sidebar. I think this is unique as an event in the Bible. This is something that I've thought about a lot. I don't have a lot of conclusions about it, though. Even if you're a complete biblical literalist, which I don't mean to disparage the opinion, even a complete literalist must admit that the ascension was, in a sense, only a metaphor or an illusion. I don't mean that it didn't actually happen, but even if it did happen, that Jesus went up in the sky behind a cloud, I think you still have to admit that Jesus didn't actually go up in the sky and behind a cloud because heaven was behind the cloud, because heaven is not behind a cloud, right? Jesus didn't actually go up in the sky to heaven. He went to heaven, but it wasn't in the sky. Heaven isn't actually in the sky. So the physical ascension as a miracle, in a sense, it was a show that was put on for the disciples with little actual physical meaning. I mean the physical act of Jesus rising into the air. It's hard for me to say what does that even mean, other than as a display of God's power to the disciples. This is what I mean by saying even a biblical literalist has to believe the ascension was just a metaphor or an illusion. Jesus was showing how powerful he was by going up into the sky, even though the powerful act which he was doing, that is, going to heaven without dying, was not related at all to him going up in the sky behind the cloud. It was just something that he did at the same time. It's really strange. Like I said, I don't have any conclusions about this. This is just a little sidebar. Anyway, back to our main point here. Reactions to our own insignificance. First one is denial. Like I said, usually not okay. We can ignore it. That I think that usually is okay, although at a certain level we have to deal with these things, or every so often we have to think about it a little bit. Ignoring it is often okay. Here's a third choice. We can love it. This, if you know me, you probably know that this is the one I'm gonna campaign for the hardest. How do we react to our own insignificance? We should love it. I think, a big danger of ignoring and denial is that we ignore and deny the amazing beauty of the world around us. I think that we should be in awe of our world. We shouldn't be in a regular habit of denying or ignoring the reality of our world. The psalm says the heavens are declaring the glory of God, and their expanse shows the work of his hands. I think if we refuse to inquire about our world, or if we just don't care about the realities of our world, this is a missed opportunity, because the natural world is always more amazing than we expected. This is something that the Bible speaks to, and this is also something that the science of the 20th century speaks to. The world that we live in always turns out to be more fascinating than we expected it to. This is exactly what Christians should be in the business of talking about and appreciating. This is true in the physical world. It's also true in mathematics. I'm a mathematician, so I gotta slip something in there about mathematics. But the world of mathematics turns out to be more amazing and more beautiful than anybody could have expected. I got 3 examples here of this phenomenon. First example is I want to talk more specifically about our journey from special to not special in cosmology. That is the science of the large-scale universe. I think from a narrow point of view, this whole journey is kind of demoralizing to us, but it is overwhelmingly majestic. It's something really that we should love, not something that we should be ashamed of or feel depressed about. So here's a little history about this. I think about the 6th century BC. Perhaps it was Pythagoras, or at least someone around that time, was the first person to suggest that the Earth was round, a spherical Earth. This was a very early indication that the world and the larger universe are not always as they seem, right? There are, in ordinary everyday experience of the world, there's no reason to believe that the Earth is round, although there's certain things which will give you that impression. This is an early indication that things are a little more complicated than they seem to be on, say, a daily basis. Another thing is the planets. If you look up at the stars and you look closely, you'll notice that some of the stars move in a strange way. Most of the stars are sort of fixed in the sky, and they move in a very predictable way over the course of a year. They all move in a uniform way, all the stars together. The constellations move together. But there are these individual stars, the planets, that move in strange ways, and they move in kind of bizarre ways across the faces of the constellations. The motions of the planets had been predictable since Ptolemy figured out, formulas for equations for motions of planets. But he believed that the planets went around the Earth, and describing the motion of planets in this way was extremely complicated. Actually, and back then, even then, they seemed to be the same as stars. They were probably just stars which happen to move for some reason. The other ones don't, and these ones do. They look like stars. But you can see something very strange would happen. This is a very old picture. This is from the late 1800s. It's a photograph taken through a telescope of a transit of Venus across the face of the sun. See if you can predict the motions of the planets, for instance Venus, then you would actually be able to predict when Venus would go in front of the sun. Now if you thought that Venus was a star, because it looks like a star, and went in front of the sun, then you wouldn't really see anything, right? You would expect that the sun is bright, Venus is also bright, so and actually maybe you think Venus is going to go behind the sun. Anyway, you wouldn't be able to see anything, but it turns out this picture is what you see. This dot up here, that's Venus in front of the sun. This was one of the indications that the planets were actually not stars like the other stars. They didn't give off their own light, but they were actually round, dark things that didn't give off any light of their own. And it also demonstrates that the planets are, sometimes at least, closer to the Earth than the sun, which is much closer than the stars. All right, so fast forward a bit, 1600s, Copernicus was one of the first to suggest that planets actually orbit the sun. They don't orbit the Earth. The planets orbit the sun. And that the Earth is a planet. Like I said, this is one of the things that was extremely controversial back in the day, although it's not at all controversial today. This is the heliocentric model of the solar system. And Isaac Newton went a little bit farther. That he said there is only one law of motion. The sun and the planets and the moons all obey the same law of motion. That is the law of Newton's gravitation. And the same law governs motion on Earth. This was kind of a big discovery that no one really expected, but the motion that, or the law that, say, governs how the moon goes around the Earth is the same law which will cause, a rock to fall to the ground on the surface of the Earth. These seem like completely different phenomenon. Like, if they're the same, then why doesn't the moon just fall down into the Earth? If the moon is a giant rock, it should just fall down. Turns out there is only one law of gravity, and it's the same law which governs the movement of the planets and also the movement of objects on the surface of the Earth. It was a remarkable discovery, and Newton was very strongly dedicated to his faith, and he saw this as a great revelation of the unity of God's creation, that God had created one law of gravity, and that all motion that exists in the universe can be explained by one simple law. It's really a beautiful discovery. He saw holy beauty in the unity and the simplicity of God's creation. Here's a picture. This is a great picture of the Milky Way galaxy as seen from the surface of the Earth. We're going to go back in time a little bit more. Around 1100, the Arab astronomers were extremely knowledgeable at a time when nobody in Europe knew anything. They were among the first, at least, to decide that the Milky Way galaxy is made up of stars. Others at the time, and even some after, I believe that the Milky Way was some sort of a strange dust cloud. That the brightness that you see in the Milky Way galaxy is a result of some sort of glowing dust or something. Anyway, here's a quote. The Milky Way is made up of a very large number of small, tightly clustered stars, which on account of their concentration and smallness seem to be cloudy patches. So if you see something that's like a fuzzy, glowing cloud, it's actually because there's zillions of stars in there that are giving you the impression of a cloud. The number of stars, then, in the sky is actually much larger than it seems, and I think the Arabs were among the first to realize this, even more than just what you can see with the naked eye as distinguishable stars. There are sort of glowing regions which are actually made up of thousands or millions of stars. In the 20th century, of course, we learned a lot more about this. Hubble was one of the scientists who was a real leader on this, that there are other galaxies. This is a picture, again, this is taken in the late 1800s, photograph taken through a telescope of the Andromeda galaxy. We live inside of the Milky Way galaxy, which is made up of millions of stars, I think billions of stars. And for a long time, and at the beginning of the 20th century, it was believed more or less the Milky Way galaxy was the entire universe. The universe consisted of our galaxy, bunch of stars kind of clustered together in the Milky Way, and beyond that was just empty space. But actually, Hubble was the one who finally kind of put the nail in the coffin of that idea and demonstrated that the Andromeda galaxy in particular is itself a whole galaxy. You can see it looks kind of like a cloud. That's because the Andromeda Galaxy is yet another galaxy just as big as the Milky Way and extremely far away, much, much further away than the other stars. And actually there are many, many other galaxies, not just the Milky Way and the Andromeda. This is something I think, everybody is aware of this to some extent. I thought I'd share some really remarkable pictures that we have from the Hubble Space Telescope. In 1995, there was an experiment done with the Hubble Space Telescope called the Hubble Deep Field Image. And the idea behind this is actually one of the times, this doesn't happen so much in science anymore, but there are still times in science today when scientists will do an experiment and they really have no idea what the result is going to be. And this was one of those times. The idea was they had some free time on the Hubble Space Telescope, and they decided that they were going to point the telescope into a region of space which was completely black. There was, you look up into the sky with your eyes. They're going to point this telescope at nothing, a black spot in space. Just zoom in like crazy and see what you can see. Is it really empty? What do you see out there? Well, here's the picture of what they saw. They actually didn't image the full square, so this black part up here is not actually black. They just didn't focus on those bits. But this is an image of a region of the sky which we know contains no stars. What you see in this picture, every one of those points of light is a galaxy, a full galaxy. The region, how big is this area in the sky? This is the size of a dime 75 feet away. You take a region that small, it is full of galaxies, not stars, but complete galaxies. This is absolutely mind-blowing. In 2003, they decided to zoom in again. They picked a little area in the same image here, and they said, let's just zoom in again, see what we can see. Here's what you see. Looks pretty much the same. These galaxies as far as you can see. Again, then these are not stars, they're all galaxies. They actually decided, just to make sure that they didn't, for some, at random hit a hot spot, they turned the space telescope around and pointed in the opposite direction. They saw the same thing. Galaxies as far as you can see. This was called the Hubble Ultra Deep Field because they had zoomed in again. And there's one more of this. In 2012, they zoomed in yet again in a small patch of the ultra deep field. This is called the Hubble Extreme Deep Field. And again, millions of galaxies. The exposure time on this image, when you take a picture of something with faint light, you got to leave the shutter open. The exposure time on this image, I believe, was 23 days. That's how faint these galaxies appear to us because they're so far away. But it is absolutely mind-boggling. I think these pictures should be inspiring. On a certain level, they make us feel small, but I think the proper response is awe. We should be in awe of how amazing the universe is. If these things cause you to just get sad about yourself, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. The proper response is awe, I think. It makes us feel small, but this kind of feeling is actually much more majestic than the alternative. Would it make you feel any better if you looked out into deep space and saw nothing at all? I don't know if that should make us feel better. I think the fact that the universe is so vast is really an inspiration, and it should be an inspiration to us. It shouldn't be something we feel like we need to evade or somehow deny or ignore in any way. All right, here's example number 2. That was example number 1. Why we should love our own insignificance or the bigness of the universe. Infinity. Throughout the 1800s, mathematicians didn't really talk about infinity. Nowadays, infinity as a concept is something that everybody at least has heard of infinity, and it's something we're vaguely familiar with. Infinity, by the way, is not a number. That's a big misconception about infinity. It is a mathematical concept, but it's not a number. You can't start at 1, 2, 3 and keep on counting and eventually get to infinity. It's because it's not a number. Anyway, mathematicians didn't really talk about infinity, and they discussed infinite things. Like of course, they knew that there are infinitely many numbers, like the number line, but they didn't actually discuss infinity directly as a concept. Mathematician named Cantor, around the beginning of the 20th century, he wanted to see if it was really possible to treat infinity like a number and see what happens. If you try to think of infinity as if it were a number, which actually today is the way that people generally do think about it, see what happens. It turns out, Cantor did this work in the 1870s. You can compare the sizes of infinite things. I don't know if this is something you've ever thought about, but for example, you can demonstrate there are the same number of even numbers as there are odd numbers, because you can kind of add them up or make a little correspondence, right? Here's the odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, etc. And they correspond exactly to the even numbers. And so you can say, well, I guess there's infinitely many of each of them, but they are sort of corresponded in this way, so there's kind of the same number of each set. Here's a shocking discovery that Cantor made, though. Not all infinite things have the same size. Like the set of even numbers has the same size as the set of odd numbers, but there are actually other infinite things which do not have that same size. That is to say, there are different sizes of infinity. This might seem a little far out, but this has actually been established, mathematics for over 100 years now. There are different sizes of infinity. Specifically, Cantor showed the amount of whole numbers, like the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, that's different. The number of those things is different from the amount of all real numbers. That would include the fractions and the irrational numbers also. And he actually gave names to these things. The first amount he called Aleph 0, the next one is called Aleph 1, and he showed that Aleph 0 is less than Aleph 1. Even though both are infinite, one of them is bigger and one of them is smaller. Leads you to wonder, are there other sizes of infinity? There's two that I mentioned here, Aleph 0 and Aleph 1. Are there any more? Well, yes, there are. You probably thought I was going to say that. There is something called Aleph 2. There's Aleph 3, etc., right? There's even more than this might suggest. There's also something which is called Aleph 0. This is like the smallest infinity, and then you can make a bigger one like that, etc., right? Actually, there's infinitely many different sizes of infinity. Little surprising, I think. People were a little nervous when Cantor started talking about this, because it sounded to a lot of people just like things that mathematics shouldn't be talking about, different sizes of infinity. But it's completely legitimate mathematics. I said there's infinitely many different infinities. Here's a question, just to blow your mind a little bit more, if you want. When I say there's infinitely many different infinities, how many exactly different infinities are there? If there's infinitely many, but there's different sizes of infinity, right? So when I say there are infinitely many, which of the infinities am I referring to when I say there are infinitely many different sizes of infinity? And it turns out that this question, what exactly is the size of the set of all infinite sizes? This question is unanswerable in the mathematical theory that was developed by Cantor, and still today this question doesn't really have a mathematical answer. Anyway, these discoveries and even the questions, not just the answers, but the questions themselves are awe-inspiring. And this is not even about the world, the physical world. This is somehow some kind of a deeper level of reality, even beyond the physical existence, but just the nature of logic and the nature of pure reason in the universe that we live in. Cantor, like I said, Cantor's work was controversial. The initial response was that infinity is a philosophical or a theological concept which has no place in mathematics. And people, I still hear this from Christians every so often. When we're trying to, understand something about God or the way that God works, they say, "Well, God is infinite, and you can never understand things which are infinite." That I cringe a little bit inside when people say that, because it's not true. We can actually understand a lot of things about infinity. Anyway, eventually mathematicians accepted Cantor's ideas because it's a beautiful theory, and it led to a lot of really interesting and important work in mathematics. And eventually, by the early 20th century, it was completely mainstream. And this Hilbert, a famous mathematician of that time, he said, "No one shall expel us from the paradise that Cantor has created." Once you realize how beautiful the idea is, you hold on to it, and you are in awe of it. You don't want to ever give it up. Okay, number 3 example of awe-inspiring big discoveries: DNA. This is another thing that I think pretty much everybody's heard of DNA. People basically know what DNA is. All living things have DNA. For some reason, well, I think I know the reason, but church people, Christians in America especially, are not. They don't like to talk about DNA very often because it feels somehow controversial. But the existence of DNA and the mechanism of what DNA does is not controversial at all. DNA, all living things have DNA. It's a long molecule which encodes the information about how to construct the organism. When you were born from your mommy and your daddy, at some point in the physical act of creating your new body, there was a physical transfer of information from the parent's body, from their cells, into your new cells, which instructed the new cells about how they were supposed to build the body up. Right? When the cells, when you're growing in the womb, you don't have a brain, or at least not at first. But there is still some mechanism inside of those cells which will instruct them and contains the information about how to build the rest of your body. And that information is the DNA. Different cells have different jobs, but they all contain the DNA sequence for the entire organism. If you think about it, it kind of has to be this way because when you are developing, before birth, you begin as a single cell, and that single cell has to basically divide itself and divide and divide and divide over and over again until it makes up the millions of cells which are in your body. And every one of those cells needs to be capable of dividing again to continue building your body. And so every one of those cells, even the cells in your fingernail, contain the full DNA sequence, which could in theory be used to construct your entire body. The entire DNA sequence is contained in every cell. In theory, if you could understand the DNA completely, you could tell what my eye color was from my toenails. If you extracted DNA, look very carefully in the sequence of DNA, you could see all of the information that was used to construct my body. Now, we don't have the capability to do that. Technologically, we don't understand the DNA sequence completely, but in theory, that information is in the DNA sequence. So the DNA sequence tells us how to build the entire organism. In particular, it tells the organism how to construct new cells. That's what I said before. And these new cells also must contain the entire DNA sequence. I don't know if this sounds amazing to you yet, but actually, what this means in particular, the DNA sequence includes a complete description of how to replicate the DNA sequence. That's because the DNA sequence contains a complete description of everything, every essential activity that needs to happen for the body to function. And part of that functioning is instructions about how to replicate the DNA sequence. All right. This actually should remind you a bit of the first slide in the talk. There was actually a reason I put that in there. The DNA sequence must include a complete description of how to replicate the DNA sequence itself. That means part of the DNA sequence must include information about what is in the DNA sequence, just like my first slide there. This kind of weird self-reference is a basic mechanism which is necessary for all life. All living things have DNA which works according to the same mechanism here. I think this is awe-inspiring regardless of where you think DNA comes from. If you think DNA comes sort of arose as a result of random events in the evolution of living things, that is actually a shocking thing, that the DNA sequence is capable of this kind of self-reference, which I said, at the beginning. For me as a human being, to intentionally try to make that kind of self-referential information is actually very hard to do. Sometimes not possible. If you think just God sort of made the DNA sequences out of nowhere, that is awe-inspiring. That God has created this kind of completely self-referential system. And it is just as awe-inspiring if you believe that the DNA sequence kind of self-assembled by natural forces. I think this is just an amazing fact, any way you slice it. These discoveries about our world, I think they leave us deeply humbled, but they instill a deep feeling of awe. And these two things go together. It seems, at times it can seem like they are in conflict with each other, but really the feeling of being humbled is kind of the same as the feeling of awe. It's a holy and sacred awe, I think, that is bound together with our own humility, and it can't be separated. I think this is how God wants us to see the natural world, the world around us. So here's my conclusions, such as they are. I think we shouldn't deny reality because God permeates reality, and you'll end up denying Him. If you're in the business of denying reality, sooner or later you're going to deny something true about the nature of God. I think if everything seems too big to you, then just serve God however you can. Loving people is sometimes more mighty and more significant than it seems. And I think when we look more closely and carefully at the world, we might have to change some of our own ideas, but we will see more of God, not less. So don't stop looking. That's all. Thanks for coming.